today our topic is decision fatigue and burnout. And so I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, or us introduce ourselves. So I'm Melanie. So I'm a psychologist by trade. So I work at JDRF as the mental health lead. So that's sort of my role here, but I also work on the insulin pump program. I've been at JDRF for, I think, 6 years, potentially 7, I'm not sure, maybe 6 years. But I've been involved with JDRF for a long time. I've got a son that has type 1, who's the 19-year-old noisy boy downstairs. And he's had type 1 since he was 2. So it's been in our world for as long as I can remember. My whole parenting journey has had type 1 in it pretty much. And before JDRF, I was working in private practice. So I was working at a diabetes service for 10 years, a pediatric service as well. And so I'll let Keely introduce herself. Keely's our guest speaker for tonight. I'm going to hand over to you, Keely.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to join today. So I'm also a psychologist by trade. I'm actually joining you from the end of a clinical day. I still work in private practice 1 day a week, but I also work 3 days a week as a research fellow with the Rio Tinto Children's Diabetes Centre in Perth. And I'm also very grateful to be supported by JDRF and some of the research that I do. So my kind of research is predominantly in paediatric type 1 diabetes, and I lead the mental health theme there. So I've got kind of a broad range of studies under that, but certainly today's topic is something that I kind of do a lot of work in. And yeah, so it's really great to be here today. And this is actually my favourite part of getting to do this work, is actually chatting with people who live with type 1 or have family members that live with type 1, because I think every time I do, I learn something new. And certainly before I joined the team in 2018. I've had 2 periods of maternity leave since that time. So, but I didn't know anything about diabetes when I joined the team, and it was a really steep learning curve for me, and I still learn new things every day. So, yeah, it's a great opportunity for me to connect with you guys and learn a bit about your experiences, and to share a little bit about the work that I do as well.
How common do you think burnout is? Does everybody know what burnout is when we talk about burnout and decision fatigue?
What I do want to say about that is that although that the idea of burnout has been around for a while, kind of diabetes burnout's been recognised for quite a while. I think it was first sort of spoken about in the literature in the 80s. It's actually, there's been limited kind of really systematic research around it, and partly that's because we haven't had until sort of more recently good tools for measuring it and a really clear definition of what it is, because there tends to be overlap with other concepts like depression and diabetes distress, which you guys, I'm just going to assume that most of you are familiar with this idea of diabetes distress. So yep, there is a bit of overlap, and we know that obviously living with diabetes is incredibly challenging, and there's those estimates of people needing to make an additional 180 decisions a day in relation to diabetes. And that's where that decision fatigue comes in, right? Because you're constantly on and having to think through these things. And I guess when we think about the concept of diabetes distress, we know that there are certain pain points in living with diabetes, and that's likely to cause, like the experience of negative emotion. One of the differences in our kind of conceptual understanding of distress versus burnout is kind of around the chronic nature of it. But also there tends to be kind of 3 key components of burnout in the way that we understand it now. And that's this sort of sense of exhaustion. So a total physical and mental exhaustion, a tendency to detach both from the people around us, but also from our diabetes and our diabetes management. And then a sense of kind of powerlessness, or like a loss of control. I actually wonder if it's helpful to share. I found this graphic because I think often when we talk about burnout in the general population, we often think about it in terms of work. Yeah. So I found this graphic that kind of shows, I guess, a bit of a comparison between like diabetes burnout. And I wonder if I can just share that with you, whether that would be helpful for our discussion. So I think when what a lot of people in the general population will be more familiar with is this idea of like occupational burnout. And so you have those feelings of exhaustion. So this is down the left-hand side there, of the kind of excessive demand. So it's really when the demands are outstripping your capacity, is kind of a simple explanation of it. But often what's associated with that is this feeling of kind of being blocked in being effective and productive, like you're blocked from succeeding in what you're trying to do. And you kind of lose that sense of purpose and meaning behind it. And that's where you can get this sort of at the bottom, the cynicism, the apathy towards work. You kind of lose interest in it. You're sort of there in body, but not really in spirit. But what we know, and like what I see in my clinical work as well, like with people with occupational burnout, is you get these sort of signs and symptoms that things are not going well. And it's quite similar, I guess, with diabetes burnout, except that we're really focused around kind of that sense of loss of control over the diabetes itself, over the management, feeling like what we're doing is not effective or not able to keep up with the demands. And that can cause us to want to sort of detach from our self-care, detach from our, stop showing up to appointments, those sorts of things, to just disengage from it a bit, and also from the people around us who are usually sort of supports.
I think it's really interesting, Keely, to think of it as in, because we do often think of burnout as in work burnout and, that sort of stuff. I think it's really, I quite like this when you showed it to me earlier, about all this, how it's similar, but it's just that real diabetes focus in there, that just because it impacts every part of your day, and diabetes is every part of your day, and it's so involved in your day-to-day tasks that when you're feeling burnt out, there's so much else that goes with it and has such a role on impact. There is one comment that's come through. Yeah. Unfortunately, no days off from diabetes, but you can take time off from work. That's the difference.
100%. And I was just gonna say that is that often, like if I'm working with someone clinically, we look at how do we reduce that load. It's no days off from diabetes, so it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
Or a lot more complicated. I'm curious about that first question. Are people with type 1
and who have poor sleep more likely to get diabetes burnout? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what? It's interesting because when we look at the literature, because we haven't had a really great conceptualization, we've sort of had a felt sense of what burnout is without a great kind of theory and model of it in the literature. The evidence around who's more at risk is actually quite lacking at the moment. So far, and I don't know whether this is interesting to everyone else or just to my research brain, but it was only in 2021 that we actually had a scale to measure burnout that was released, the diabetes burnout scale. So the ability to actually measure it and say, well, how many people suffer from this, and what are the risk factors and what are the protective factors? We're actually lacking some of that research at the moment. And the little research that's been done hasn't really identified any really strong risk factors or protective factors for it. I tend to think about it, and one thing I'm really mindful of is that diabetes doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the context of all the other aspects of your life.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of a cumulative load. If you are not sleeping well, which I think was the comment in there generally, and you add in, managing diabetes, or if you're, which I often hear from people living with diabetes, is it's not just the diabetes, it's the diabetes plus this other chronic condition that we live with, or this other neurodivergent profile, or the financial insecurity that we have at the moment, or whatever it is. It's all these other aspects of our life that actually adds to that load.
Yeah. We've got some other questions there. Someone's saying, to have burnout, is there a time frame for it to be burnout, or can it happen for days or hours?
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
There's not a great definition of this. It's not that if you felt this for, X number of days, it's now classified as burnout. I'm really curious. It does tend to be more chronic, and sometimes it can go on for a really long period of time if it's not kind of addressed. One of the differences between burnout versus, say, diabetes distress is diabetes distress can be more transient. It can be very much in the moment that this thing feels really, really challenging, but we're able to then move on and have a change in how we feel about it. Whereas burnout does tend to be a thing that we kind of get a bit stuck in for longer without support.
So got a few comments here. People are saying you do feel to tend more alone with your diabetes management. I think it can be really isolating, because if unless there's other people around, as much as there's people around to support you, and nobody knows what it's like. Nobody knows the action. I always say, as a parent, I know what the burden of diabetes is like for a parent. I know what it's like for me, and I know that role, but I don't know the burden for my son. I can imagine what it might be, but I don't actually have, just like I always say to him, he can't understand what it's like to be a parent either. You know, when they have a throwback, it's not you with diabetes. True, I don't have diabetes, but for him, he doesn't understand what it's like to be a parent either. So there's differences, and we all, and you know, unless we're able to connect with other people, it can feel really isolating, and you can feel really alone. Here we got some results up.
Yeah, frustrated.
Yeah.
Yeah, tired, angry,
Yeah.
feeling controlled by diabetes. Absolutely.
I think that powerlessness one is something that I often think about. Tired's always up there, isn't it? And overwhelmed. But that powerlessness thing, this kind of idea with diabetes is that sometimes you can do everything right, and it still, you know, kicks you. You know, you can do all the right things, and you can do the same thing 2 days in a row, and you can get these different results. And sometimes there is definitely this feeling of, you know, not being able to have control, and that can be really uncomfortable. And so I think that can definitely lead into, you know, burnout and distress and that sort of build up of it. I was going to say, we were talking earlier, Keely, about how do you know if you're feeling burnout? Like, does anybody know what sort of symptoms, we talked a little bit about, so those symptoms there, but has anybody noticed anything, if you have been experiencing something like this, you know, what are the things that you might see or have noticed? Is anybody brave to chat?
Yeah, my 6-year-old,
Yes,
she'll
please,
take off
yeah.
she'll take actually off her pump and like just walk away from it and like just not want to interact or do anything around diabetes.
Yeah, so she's just like, I've had enough, Mum. I'm out.
Yeah,
totally.
I'm out for a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, I just love the freedom of little kids to just say,
Oh, I know. I'm
done.
out. Yeah.
I'm out. Yeah, unfortunately, as a parent, you're then the person that has to kind of pick it up and try and, you know, massage them back into it. But I do love, like, little kids are so closely connected to that emotional experience, and they haven't kind of learned all the stuff that we as adults put in place. We still feel the same stuff as well. We just, you know, we can't express it in the same way. I'm always really curious because I think burnout is one of those things we can often be slow to recognize in ourselves. Sometimes we can pick it up, I think, in our loved ones a little bit more easily than we can pick it up in ourselves. And I'm just wondering if anyone is aware of, or if they feel like they've experienced burnout, what their warning signs are that they're kind of headed down that path.
Amy's sitting here just feeling exhausted, and that level of exhaustion that sleep doesn't help. Like, I think.
Yeah. So you wake up, you're still feeling exhausted, even if you've had a decent sleep. There's a comment there about, is joint pain a symptom? We definitely know that, like, during periods of high stress, we tend to get increases in our inflammatory response. And so certainly increased pain can be a thing for a lot of people, particularly if they do have sensitive like immune responses.
I think for me, it's I get to a point where I don't care what I eat. Sometimes I'll even, if I'm heading towards a hypo, I'll go, oh no, I just want to ignore the alarms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that really common signs, aren't they? Yep. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say exactly that. Like, I think one thing that I see clinically is a lot of the things that we know are good for us, our self-care stuff, so I always think like diet, physical activity, you know, sleep, and then things like, you know, alcohol consumption or, you know, those sorts of things. When we're feeling high levels of stress and headed down that path towards burnout, those things can start to slip. We start neglecting some of the things that we know are like help us to feel good, because we just can't kind of manage that added load of doing all the right, quote unquote, right things.
But I mean, but we know that the extra load on top of the diabetes load is high. You know, like it is, you know, we say this, we do quote this 180 extra decisions a day. We have to actually, you know, give yourselves a break that's, you know, the load is actually really high, and it's not surprising. And we were talking earlier, Keely, about trying, you know, the fact that we really need to normalize the fact that burnout is actually really quite common. and understandable, and expected almost, like there's always, because you're human, and we're not robots, and there's also, like Healy was saying before, there's so many different things going on in our world outside of diabetes that sometimes that extra burden and that can just feel too much.
Yeah, I definitely think one of the things that I've noticed, like with clients that I work with, is often where you sort of go, I think you're kind of burnt out, is some people really struggle, and it can be a really confronting thing to kind of acknowledge, okay, that's what's going on for me. And I think what I've noticed is some people feel a sense of kind of shame or a sense of guilt that they should be doing better, that they should be able to cope with this. And particularly when we talk about some of the things associated with burnout, when we start to kind of neglect, our diet or our exercise or we stay up late scrolling in our phones, which is the thing a lot of people are doing at the moment to kind of detach, is that we can start to feel a sense of kind of guilt and shame about not taking better care of ourselves on top of already kind of feeling burnt out. And I think that's one thing that's really important to acknowledge, is actually burnout is incredibly common, and diabetes burnout is very, very normal. It makes total sense that you would at some point, probably multiple times, feel totally burnt out with the burden of kind of managing diabetes, and to acknowledge that, okay, I think that's what this is. And it's not a sign that you're doing anything wrong, or you're not trying hard enough, or you're not organized enough, or you're not, whatever it is, motivated enough. It's just a very, very normal part of living with this condition, I think, is the absolute first thing to kind of recognize, because then we can offer a little bit of compassion to yourself, ideally, and to other people. I think historically it used to be, before it was well recognized, it was misinterpreted as like, I hate this word, but like non-compliance.
So you can say, none of us, we don't like non-compliance. Yes, it's not a word we like.
It's not a word that we like, and it should be. I hope it's not being used very often anymore, but
I hope you don't hear it anywhere.
I hope you guys don't hear it at all. But certainly historically, I think that was the thing. It was misrecognized. People would go, well, hang on, they're not doing the things we're telling them to do.
Yeah, they're just being naughty. They just don't want to deal with it. They're just, they're just ignoring it. They're just, it's a really,
they don't care. They, whatever it is. And missing the fact that actually a lot of the time what people are seeing as kind of non-compliance was actually people just being totally burnt out with this and saying, I can't take any more of this on. I need a break. I need to stop doing this for a while. Obviously, that's really, really complicated in diabetes, but I think that's, it adds a layer of sense of judgment that I think a lot of people have probably experienced historically, that if they rock up to their appointment at the clinic and things aren't going well, that they're going to be judged for that, rather than people recognizing that, hey, look, this is really, really hard.
Yep. And then working out, and we were talking before about the work sort of burnout. So there are solutions, it seems like easier solutions that you can find for occupational burnout. You can change jobs, you can have a break, you can have a holiday, you can reduce things. With diabetes, it seems much more difficult, and there is still a basic level of things that need to be done. There are things that you can do though, and I think we're not as good at recognizing that, because we know that diabetes has to happen. So sometimes we just sort of get stuck in this fact that, well, it has to happen, and then it gets too much. I just was seeing some comments coming through.
There's a good one just then from Jane saying, when I start to experience burnout, I tend to feel and express resentment towards my husband, who's very healthy and active and can eat whatever he wants. So I think that's totally fair. There was a good question while we're still talking about symptoms. What signs should we look out for in children, especially a teenager who's already going through other teenage issues and is less likely to talk about things? So what can we see in other people?
Such a good question. I think one thing that kind of jumps to mind is that I hear from parents in particular is it's really difficult to separate what is developmentally appropriate challenges of whatever stage your child is at from what is diabetes related. I think one thing to kind of, the first thing is any kind of change necessarily, right? So if your child used to be really communicative with you and is suddenly not, and doesn't want to talk to you about things, is not kind of sharing with you, there's probably a sign there that something's going on, and trying to find a way to sort of check in with them. I recognize that can be really difficult. But I think certainly any kind of change in what is their normal was something to kind of look out for. I mean, I'm really mindful, Mel, that you've got a teenager.
Yeah, look, I think it's really interesting, and I have this very strong memory of a million years ago when my son was little, and we were away on holidays, and he was about to go on this surfing lesson, and I was getting all geared up as the parent to go and have my conversation with the instructor, say, look, he's got diabetes, you know, do the big spiel that we as parents get all ready to do to help our anxiety and just make sure that our kids are safe, with that extra diabetes level on top of just normal parenting stuff. And it was so amazing. The guy said to me, oh, actually, my son, the 25-year-old cool surfer dude, had type 1 himself. And so it was the best thing I'd ever thought of. And so my son happily went off, and they had this whole discussion. He had to go out with his hypo treatment, and they were all great. But we were chatting with his dad, the 25-year-old's dad, while they were out surfing. And he just spoke about something that stuck with me forever. He spoke about the fact that sometimes his son just would talk to him, or, you know, you would see that things were not quite right. He wasn't doing it as much. He wasn't, you know, they were having to remind him to do stuff more often. They were having to have these sorts of conversations. So they're noticing, like you were saying, Keely, before, they're noticing bits that weren't happening as much as they were. And so sometimes his son would just say, his son would have a week off. And so, but his parents would just take over. And so it'd be not take, we can't take everything over, but there were those bits that you could just reduce that burden for them in that bit. So to be honest, my son still does it now. Every now and then we have to do a finger prick. He'll stick his finger out to me and go, you just do it, Mum. You know, like there are these little bits where it's kind of just, if you can take some of those bits back and you can, and have that break. So there are windows of opportunities where you can sort of take some of that burden. And it's not, obviously you can do that as a parent, but you can have partners, or there are things that you might be able to tweak in terms of other sort of teenage behavior. It's so tricky. I think it's really tricky because teenagers are you know, beast into themselves, and, you know, sometimes can be really chatty about all sorts of things. Sometimes don't want a bar of you talking about diabetes. And I think, you know, Keely and I, we've spoken about this before, about there's shifting in roles and things that we do, and whose roles and responsibilities are that. I think if we can keep having those conversations about whose roles there are, and you want to share stuff out, and, you know, if you want to do the set changes for them, or the injections, or they want a break, like, I think that open communication is actually, if they're willing to do that, or just take bits off them. If you can see that things are changing, you just say, look, I'll do that for now. Like, I can do that one, and just sort of really encourage that. And it doesn't mean they have to, because again, and I think as adults even, there's this guilt that we should be able to do it ourselves. And sometimes we don't want to let other people do it. But if we can just say, just as a, you know, I'll do this one for a little bit, and just give that break in that breathing space, I think can be really useful. But
yeah. I remember speaking to a family who talked about a similar thing, that they had a DOD. It was a day off diabetes for their teenage daughter. So they noticed that things that, you know, she didn't quite seem herself. She wasn't as communicative. She wasn't, you know, wasn't smiling as much, wasn't happy as much. They could say, do you need a DOD?
Yeah.
You know, and it was exactly that. She could just not have to make the decisions and think about it and be as independent, and they would step in and do more of those things for them in that moment.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to have, and give ourselves permission to have those days, you know, where we, you know, do get to feel it and do get to have the break. I think Evie's got a hand up.
It's not necessarily a question, but I know that as a teenager, I definitely did experience burnout. And just kind of a piece of advice in retrospect for parents. Yeah. I found it really difficult with my mum, because a lot of the time she was focusing on, you're not, like, your management's not going well, like, you're not bolusing, those kind of things. And kind of our entire relationship became about diabetes.
Yeah.
And I guess still trying to find something non-diabetes related to have a relationship with a parent about, it was kind of really important. It kind of took us a couple of years to get there, but obviously parents worry a lot, but
kind
really
of being able to try and have that
extra, trying to have that extra little space to have that different kind of relationship, even if it's just go out for like coffee or cake or something, and just not mention diabetes.
Yeah, it's a lot of the work I do with my parents in the parent groups that I run is about really making it important to not make diabetes the first question that we ask, because it's so hard if your kids have been at school, or if your loved one's been away, and sometimes it's what you've been thinking about. We have to try and, you know, suck those questions back in and make sure it's not the first thing to ask. It's really tricky. Yeah. Like, I think it can be really tricky,
especially like as a teenager as well, when you kind of want you just want to fit in. Like I noticed, especially like even using a pump, like getting it out at lunchtime and things like that was kind of just an extra thing because there was no one else in my high school that was diabetic. So it's kind of just like that extra thing where you just want to fit in. And then if diabetes is kind of the center of conversations at home as well, it's just
all too much.
I was just going to say, like, I definitely think one thing that comes through really strongly in literature is like that period, we kind of call it emerging adulthood now. So like there is so much change that happens for young people around like those kind of later adolescence into adulthood stages, and burnout is really common around then. And so kind of understanding that's a really normal, and I think that's, you're juggling so many different demands. As an adult you do as well, but as a young person, like there's so many shifts in, you know, your sense of identity, your social relationships, moving from school into the like workforce or into further study, becoming financially independent, trying to learn how to become an adult, and trying to become more independent in your diabetes management. It's a huge load, and I think a lot of young people experience burnout around those stages as well.
Because I actually don't want young people to be thinking that like having diabetes is the top of their priority. I don't ever want that. You know, I want that to be way down on the list, because there is so much more important things that you should be focusing on and are much more enjoyable to focus on than diabetes. But it's a tricky balance. Like I think, and I think it does create lots of conflict with parents, between parents and their teens, because parents freak out. Parents look too far into the future. We're not very good at sometimes stepping back and remembering what it might have been like to be a teenager. You know, so I think that can make it tricky. I used to, when my son was younger, I just used to take his pump and just stand beside him and bolus when I kept knowing he'd forgotten, and then just put the pump back. So I have no words. Like we didn't discuss it. He would be playing his game and I just like do it and go back. So we didn't have to have the conversation and to try and avoid the, have you bolused yet? Come on, mate, hurry up. Do, you know, just try and have not as many words, because it's just, he still forgets, you know, but he's 19. Of course he forgets.
One thing, there's a couple of questions there about the role of technology, and a couple of people have shared that like pumps have been really helpful for them, and like CGM in particular. I will say, like the one when I was doing a little bit of looking in the literature around this, I said before, like there's not a lot of evidence for any particular risk factors, as in, so there was a question about like how long would you have lived with diabetes before this might happen, and like this, a couple of studies didn't actually find any relationship between how long you've had diabetes and your experience of burnout. So some people have sort of said anecdotally that you know, getting diagnosed really young has made it easier because they didn't know anything different, right? They're not dealing with that sort of adjustment, whereas other people have sort of said they've actually experienced burnout a little bit earlier. But the evidence isn't quite there. The one thing that did come through is that people who were using CGM tended to have lower rates of burnout. And I think it's interesting because it can be such a valuable tool in reducing the mental load. But we also know that for some people, there is an overwhelm of information. And I think one thing that comes through a bit as well is if we tend to be somebody who has quite high expectations of ourselves and kind of tight rules around, you know, what's an acceptable range for us, like what is, you know, what do we expect of ourselves in our diabetes management, that can be a bit of a risk factor, because it adds to that pressure and that load of like, I have to be doing this right, I have to, you know, meet all of my targets, I have to, you know, I can't be out of range. And one of the things that when we talk about what do we do if we're burnt out, and we know we said before you can't take a break from diabetes, but one thing we can do is say, can we at least temporarily reduce the expectations on ourselves that we're going to do diabetes perfectly?
Yeah.
We're
never going to do it perfectly anyway.
No, exactly. But can we kind of reduce the expectations a little bit and say, do you know what? I'm just going to make it a little bit easier on myself just for a little while, so that I'm not having to make as many decisions. So I'm not having to stress over every single, you know, moment. And that can be really challenging for some people, particularly if we tend to be somebody who wants to kind of have that level of control over it. Letting go can be very, very challenging. But it can
personality types too, isn't it, Keely?
And Martin made a good comment and said he turns the alarms off his pump when he's, you know, when you're kind of heading into that. But I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit more about, so if you are feeling like you're getting into burnout? Like, is there a checklist of things you could do? Or like, if you're really, really bad, what should you do? Like when you suddenly, or someone says something to you and kind of says, what's up? And you go, oh yeah, this isn't right. Just wondering if you have any advice on that.
Yeah.
I think, I just want to ask, is anybody very good at listening to people when they tell us? I think none of us are very good at sort of recognizing. I think we talked about, you know, what you're saying, Mel, is about recognizing. And so if our family members are starting to say things to us, has anybody experienced that? Because part of me wants to say, I'm fine, leave me alone. You know, like part of me feels like my response would be that, you know, like, it's fine. You don't know what you're talking about. Back off. Has anybody got any? People are nodding at me, so that's a bonus.
Yes, there's a lot of nods. There's a lot of nods. I mean, I think definitely in terms of the good thing is there are things that we can do about burnout, but firstly we do need to kind of recognize. I think the first part of it is recognizing it and really understanding that it's totally normal. It's not anything that you're doing wrong or that you've, you know, contributed to. The load that you are facing is enormous. And there are going to be times where it just outstrips your capacity, and that's completely normal. So I think the first step is to recognise it and understand that, you know, this is a part of what you guys are living with, and then to get some support around it as well. So looking at, and this is where it can be really helpful to work with like a mental health provider, or, you know, or to talk to somebody in your network that you feel really safe and secure with, to kind of say, because often when we're in burnout, it's really hard to think about what do I do about it, because your brain is totally overloaded at that point. You're exhausted. You're cognitively not able to kind of get that executive functioning going to plan your way out of it. So to have the support of somebody else to say, hey, look, what about this? What if we tried this? So we know you can't like have a day off diabetes. We can't sort of totally ignore it, but what would it look like to reduce the load? So things like, you know, can we turn the alarms off? Is there someone that we can say, look, I need a day off. Can you hold?
Can you do these bits for me? Yeah.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
Also looking at other things in the rest of what's going on for us in our lives where we can reduce the load there as well. If we're dealing with multiple kind of stresses at the same time. I was talking to a mum of a teenager with diabetes the other day, and she was saying she made the decision, like the coming home and having people say, what's for dinner? She couldn't anymore. She's like, I cannot decide what is for dinner. I feel her pain. Yeah. Every night, right? So she made the call to get HelloFresh 4 nights a week, because then all she has to do is say, which of these do you want? You know, like, and I will make it, and I don't have to go to the shop and think about it. The mental load of at least that part of my life is taken care of. So if we can't totally remove the load from diabetes, can we reduce the burden elsewhere to free up a bit of capacity? And then, as hard as it can be, is to really think about what are the things, like when things are going well and I'm taking care of myself, what does it look like? You know, what do I exercise more? Am I connecting more with people? Because one thing we do when we're burnt out often is we stop connecting with the people that we normally would, often because we feel like we can't show up the way that we want to.
Yeah.
And that can be a real barrier to getting support. So is there some way that we can still connect with the people that love us, that care for us, that understand us, even if we're not showing up the way that we necessarily want to, and know that that's okay? And that's where I think like there's real power for the type 1 community and being able to like to lean into that peer support, because you guys know that there are other people out there who totally get it without you having to say a word. Right. So if you don't have somebody in your network in your like kind of immediate network that you feel really in that moment that you feel comfortable to reach out to and say, I'm really struggling with this, or even just to be able to show up in like a really kind of, you know, flat sort of non-energetic way, is there a way to connect with some of the type 1 community? Just say, oh God, this sucks. I'm really struggling with it.
I mean, I see it, and hopefully some of you are members of our JDS Facebook groups, you know, just even the Facebook groups you've got there, and I often see people on there just, you know, just voicing that they're having a bad day or just saying something. But, you know, there is just that process of just saying that. And what I love and to see is the support of the type 1 community. I mentioned that earlier about how amazing the type 1 community is. They are lovely, you know, and there is I just don't think you can bottle that, because there is those days, and same for parents. You know, I think sometimes you just have to go, oh my God, this is like driving me crazy and I can't do it today. And, you know, people just hearing it and feeling it and just reflecting it, that they have that times too, can be really helpful. Someone's put that in the comments, that it helps to get together, Keely, with others.
Yeah, and I think certainly, like I see that clinically as well, is that social support can be really, really buffering, like that sense of connection, and knowing that we're not alone in it, even if like it doesn't have to be about looking for solutions, but just to be able to be with somebody and know that like it's hard and that's okay, and they can sit in it with you.
Yeah, we don't need everybody to fix it, do we? We don't need someone to fix it.
That was something I was going to say. For me, I have a very supportive husband, and but there are times when I just need to vent, and he wants to fix it.
Yeah.
And he comes up with some great options, and I'm just not there, and I don't want to hear it. I just want to say this sucks.
Yeah.
And I think that's the value of connecting with other type ones, is that we can just say it sucks, and they know what that means, and sometimes there is no fixing it. It's just the facility and the ability to vent.
Yeah. And one thing I'll kind of say about that, which might sound a little bit strange, but there's something really beautiful about when we connect with other people, where when we're having a really hard time and we're able to connect with somebody else who gets it, it can actually bring out in us compassion for somebody else's experience as well. And the beautiful thing about that, one, it enhances that sense of connection and community. But if we're able to step into a place where we can be compassionate towards others, it actually enhances our capacity to be compassionate towards ourselves and offer ourselves a bit of that kindness and say, actually, do you know what? Yeah, this does suck, and I'm trying really hard, and I'm doing the best that I can.
They're also clearly an opportunity. I was just thinking in terms of, you know, I'm thinking as my parent teenage sort of brain, but you know, there's opportunities where I remember seeing a client years ago, this 16-year-old, she'd get really cranky at her parents. She didn't have, not diabetes related, but they sort of put some rules in place in terms of when we knew this, you know, she was having sort of anger management issues, and she would get to this kind of level, and her and her mum had come to this sort of agreement that, you know, if mum could see her getting to a certain level, then they had a plan. I think they used to put a big glass of water on the table, and that was sort of the message that we need a timeout, we need a break. And, you know, so you put some rules around what will happen in the future. It's like, you know, rules to argue or rules to plan. So, you know, you could I'm just sort of imagining having a conversation with your husband saying, if there are times when, you know, and it's like you put your little card up, say, this is my I need to vent card, and you don't actually get to give me any advice, you know, like a little moment where this is, I'm setting it up before in advance. So in the moment when we're all too stressed and heightened, and he's going to get cranky because he's trying to help and you just don't want his help, you know, like where it just creates more conflict. If you can, you know, plan for those moments and have a bit of an action plan in place, I think those things can be really helpful, because it, number one, has a conversation about it to start with. So you sort of, when you're not in that space, you can plan it and chat about it, and they can kind of understand it, I think.
Yeah, and I think it can circumvent some, like in those relationships that we have with people where we are secure, and you know, we have we actually have a bit of freedom to sort of get it wrong and try again, and you know, trial and error a few things. It's okay to actually say, do you know what, I'm not needing this right now, I'm actually needing a space to vent. And sometimes that can be difficult to say in the moment, so having those little shortcuts to signal to each other, like, this isn't one of those times. This is you know, I see. And it can kind of circumvent that misplaced helping, where we end up feeling quite resentful because the other person doesn't get it. Really, the other person loves us and is desperately trying to help, but we're saying, it's just not what I'm needing right now. And kind of on that point, and I wish I'd sort of found a graphic for this. One thing that can be really helpful when we're in burnout is to actually reflect on, like, what is it that we're needing? And that can be a really big question, and it can be a really difficult thing. Honestly, like, half my practice is helping people work out what their needs are and how to meet them. So I recognize it's a big question, but as a little sort of shortcut, you can Google lists of, like, what are our core needs, and there'll be different variations on this, but it's something like a sense of security, connection to others, spontaneity and play, which I think as adults we forget we need. We think of kids needing play, but adults need it too. I'm missing, what are my other ones? Hang on. Rest is a big one. A sense of achievement, a sense of kind of meaning and purpose in what we're doing. So sometimes it can be helpful to reflect on when we're feeling really stuck or feeling frustrated or low, like what do I need right now? Sometimes it's comfort. And then kind of saying, well, what does comfort look like to me? Is it giving myself permission to go and have a bath? Is it, you know,
the lounge and watching some crappy TV and just
watching
turning off?
Crappy TV? Is it getting a hug from somebody that we care about? You know, what does play look like for us? You know, and thinking creatively about because as adult, working out what our sense of play is can be, is it dancing? Is it singing really loudly to a song while I'm driving my car? If you have kids, is it playing with your kids? Is it saying we're going to go, you know, to the park and run around like lunatics for a while? Like, so trying to think about, you know, if these are sort of fundamental human needs that we all have, how do I tick some of those boxes for myself right now? Will that help me to kind of alleviate some of this heaviness that you're feeling at that time? One thing I'm really curious about that came up in the research is people were reflecting on what helped them in times of burnout. And one of the things that came through was this idea of acceptance. And I always, I have a difficult relationship with the word acceptance because I think it's an interesting thing to say. Like when you say to people, like, we've got to kind of accept these things, there's not a lot of a how in that. It's not very clear, like, how do we get accept it? Like, you know, and I really wanted to ask you guys what your, I guess, relationship is to that word and what it means to you. Is that an idea that resonates with you? Like if we were talking about acceptance in terms of diabetes burnout, what would that actually look like? How would we do that? How do we get there?
There's a comment here from, did you see the comment from Liz, a mum of 2 type 1s?
Now.
Talking about how she's had to just accept that sometimes I just won't get it right. Through no fault of your own, completely.
Yeah. So is that part of it? Is it sort of acknowledging that, like, there are some parts of this that are out of your control and it's, you know, no matter how hard you try, accepting the fact that I might need help or a guilt-free diabetes day. Absolutely.
Do you think acknowledge is a better word, Keely, instead of accept?
Maybe.
Like, is it just that we just have to, I just want to say we just have to accept, but we just need to learn or understand that this is what's going to happen sometimes. And you always think about, we kind of need to roll with it a little bit, and that we can't actually control as much as we want to control everything and as much as we want to be in control of everything that happens to us and around us. And I think when diabetes comes in the picture, we think, oh, there's stuff I can do, there's things I can control. Generally, we all learn very quickly, but there are lots of parts of that we can't control. And hopefully we learn that because it's true. And I think acknowledge, learning, understanding that, I think really helps. I would say that's one of the things to help the most in accepting or being kinder to ourselves. I think we are not kind enough to ourselves. There's a huge burden of living with diabetes, living with being a parent, living with diabetes yourself, or loving someone that has diabetes. You know, there's a lot there. There's a lot there, and I think we just need to be kind because everybody's managing that on top of everything else in the world and everything else in our day-to-day lives that we're trying to do. Evie's saying the fact you might need help or a guilt-free diabetes day. Yeah, I think sometimes, remember, is it Joe Solowitchik? I can't remember. I never know how to say his last name. He always talked about every sort of 3 months, he'd book himself a sick day off work, and he would, eat ice cream, eat whatever he wants to do, watch all sad movies, and just have a big, I feel sorry for myself, diabetes sucks. And he's like, by 11 o'clock, I'm kind of done. But I'm just, it's just about giving yourself permission to sit in it and do what you need to do and just feel a bit, this sucks and it's okay to feel like that. But I've always liked that idea that I always think we have to have permission to feel it and acknowledge that we're allowed to feel it and that we're not going to get it right.
Yeah, there's a concept in parenting work when we think about like trying to raise really healthy, confident kids. and everybody wants to kind of do the best job that they can as parents. And I've got 2 little ones at the moment, so this is very kind of front of mind for me. But there is a concept in kind of in the parenting kind of research and work around the idea of the good enough parent.
I'm a big fan of good enough parenting.
Yeah. Love the good enough parent. So it's this recognition that so basically, you know, those core needs that I went through before, they're true for little kids as well, right? And really, as parents, we want to kind of be able to recognize what our child's needing, kind of anticipate it, almost see it in the moment, respond to it. But we're never going to get it right 100% of the time, and we actually don't need to.
No.
We really, really don't need to. And one thing they talk about in parenting as well is this idea of rupture and repair, right? So what's really important for little kids is not that we're perfect and it never goes wrong, is that when it goes wrong, because it will, we repair, we come back together, we talk about it, and we go, how do we, you know, we move on, and we make sure that that young person kind of feels secure in that and knows that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to have big feelings, all of that stuff. And I feel like the good enough parent, like, is a really great way of recognizing, like, we're never going to get this right 100% of the time. We're doing the very best that we can, and we actually don't need to be 100% perfect. It's okay that we get it wrong. It's okay that we, you know, fall in a heap. And I love that comment about eating a giant chocolate croissant and feeling sorry for yourself and then coming out of it, you know, like, that is actually perfect. I love that. That's beautiful. And so maybe there's something in kind of being good enough in diabetes that can be helpful to kind of say, look, actually, do you know what, I'm doing, for the most part, I'm doing pretty well, but right now this sucks and it's hard.
Or I'm doing I'm doing the most that I can today, you know, like, you know, I'm doing all I can do today. This is all I can put to it today. And, you know, and it is about, I guess, setting some, you know, we want everybody to be safe, and we want everybody to be well. And, you know, that's the scary part with diabetes. If what we can't put into it is not keeping us safe, then what we want is to make sure we've got other people around us that can help out in those moments. But it's about, you know, this is what I can manage today, and I'm going to be okay with that. And then maybe tomorrow I'll try a little bit something else. You know, this is my most important thing I want to focus on today. It might be that out of all of the things that diabetes related that I'm struggling with, I want to focus on eating breakfast today, you know, and making sure I bolus for breakfast, or giving my insulin for breakfast, you know, like, or bolusing early, or whatever it is. And you just focus on that, and don't worry about the rest of it. If the rest of the day is a bit of a write-off and you just roll with it, then we do that. And then you can feel good about getting that one part done. So it's, you know, I think things you can do is getting those little steps and focusing on those when you're in this sort of burnout. Kids always used to say, I'll just do it better. I'm like, no, you won't, like, because we know you won't. And we don't want to set ourselves up to fail by just saying, oh, I'll just be better tomorrow. Because what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up to fail, because life's going to happen. Nothing's going to change overnight, you know, like, so let's not set ourselves up to fail, and let's just work out what those core little bits are that we can do and we know we can manage or we can get help with, and start there, you know, and then you do little bits and you see what you can do for that day. And then we plan again, you know, like, I think, I just want everybody to be nicer to themselves and give yourselves a break, like, because I think there's a lot of different things to think of. And I was trying to give other tips, Mel, but
one thing I will say is with burnout, when we've kind of been through it, often we don't recognize it when it's first happening. We kind of, the first time we kind of go through it, we don't know it until we're really in it and we're really struggling, and it's somebody else saying, hang on, like, things aren't going well right now, like, you know, let's get some support around it. And so sometimes that first experience of burnout can be a big one, and often it's like, I know, you know, for me and what I see in clinic, often it's when we catch it the first time is because something big has happened. We've really kind of dropped the ball on something, or we've had a blow up with our partners in a really big way, or, you know, something really went wrong at work, or whatever it is. So sometimes the first time and that's kind of one thing I want to acknowledge, sometimes the first experience of burnout, because we're not familiar with it, we don't know what it feels like for us and what it is exactly. We just kind of keep going as things start to sort of fall apart. And then when we see it, it's when something big has happened.
Yeah.
But what I think is really important is that when we then move through that, is to kind of reflect on, okay, what are my warning signs that things are not going well? What are those sort of early signs that I can pick up on that, hang on, I'm a bit overloaded here and I need to start to put some things in place? Then we can start to think about, well, what are the things that are helpful for me? And so, you know, I don't live with diabetes, but I certainly have experienced burnout in a work capacity, and very much being aware now of those early signs for me that things are starting to slip and I'm a bit overloaded and I need to actually start to kind of look at what boundaries need to be in place, or, you know, what self-care do I need to be doing and what connections do I need to make to feel supported. So I would say, like, if you've had that experience of burnout or you've seen it in other people, try and think about what are those early warning signs for you, so that the next time the kind of consequences of it won't be so big. It might not take so long to recover from. We might be able to sort of address it a little bit sooner. And then over time, we get better at kind of preventing burnout by recognizing it sooner, doing the things that we know help us to feel good and to feel supported. Yeah.
Keely, I think you should talk about, before we go quickly, the dam analogy you spoke about earlier.
Oh,
so
right.
I really kind of like it. It's a nice way to maybe finish.
I was trying to find a graphic for it that kind of depicted it, but I've got one. So I have this analogy that I use in my practice. It's how I think about burnout. Basically, we all have a dam wall, which is our capacity to cope, and the water is kind of all the stuff that we're coping with. And we do okay as long as the water stays below the top of that wall. Once it starts to kind of lap at the surface, that's when we start to see some of those early signs of burnout and stress. So it might be that our diet isn't as kind of good as it would normally be. We might, you know, if we use alcohol, we might start drinking a little bit more than we usually would. We might be getting snappy with our loved ones. We might feel more fatigued than usual, that feeling of like not being able to kind of overcome that tiredness. And obviously what we don't want to have happen is that the dam wall bursts and all the water comes flooding out. So when I think about, like, what do we do about it, one option is there a way to reduce the amount of water that we're holding back? Can we kind of let some of it go? Or can we build up the dam wall higher? Can we fortify it somehow? And that's where we can look at being able to recognize in ourselves those early signs and learn what it is that works for us, because it is very individual. So we talked before about what are those kind of core needs, trying to be prepared to kind of trial and error some things that work for you, finding out what does play mean for me, what gives me a sense of achievement that is buffering against stress, where do I find connection? And the connection piece is a bit of an art form, because sometimes, I know there was somebody was saying before that their husband kind of goes into fix-it mode and that's not super helpful. Sometimes it's kind of putting some guardrails around what that connection is that feels safe for us. Sometimes it's about knowing who to go to get the type of connection and the support that we're needing. So if we have, you know, if our husband's a real Mr. Fix-It, but we have a friend who is happy to just eat ice cream with us and listen, great, fantastic. Or is this something that we take to the Type 1 community and say, like, I just need to be with people who understand and get it? So being prepared to kind of trial and error a little bit and think about what are the things that actually work for me when I'm struggling. So that's kind of, I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the analogy I always kind of have in my mind, is like our dam wall. Where's it at the moment?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Keely. Thank you, Keely, so much for tonight. And Melanie, obviously, we always run a little bit over because there's always so much to talk about. And yeah, there's just, our community is so awesome to talk to. But yeah, thank you so much, Mel. And yeah, we'll see you all again soon, hopefully.
See you all soon.
Beautiful.
Thanks.